Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture, the greatest show on YouTube. This episode is called Theory, Michael Hardt's Empire and Left-Wing Globalization. It begins with theory because I'm going to start dividing up my channel into different, into different portions. So some of them will begin with theory and then the title, and these will be more theoretical, speculative, abstract, jargon-laden. Some of them might say news and then the title. Some of them might say like casual or chat and then the title, and they'll be importantly different as one would expect. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about Michael Hardt's empire and left-wing globalization. It's Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri's empire, but everyone seems to be mostly associated with Michael Hardt, kind of like Marx gets associated with a lot of stuff that he and Engels did together. But anyway, the reason for this is that I've had a lot of people ask me things like, why is it that the left that I remember, the left of the 90s, was anti-globalization? They always seem to be associated with anti-globalization, but in recent years, it seems like they've come to defend globalization. They've come to defend open borders even. So, the book that I'm going to talk about in this video, I think really answers this question. And that book is Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri's Empire. It was published in the year 2000. These two, Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri, are very important, influential, serious, deep-thinking people on the political left. I actually had an opportunity to meet Michael Hardt a few years ago. He came to my school and gave a talk. And I think he's brilliant. I think this is a great book. If you haven't read it, pick it up. Slavoj Žižek, who's another thinker on the left that I like a lot, he even called it the new Das Kapital, which is a reference to Marx, and he's a Marxist, so he doesn't mean it as an insult, as some might. But eventually I'm going to make a video on why I'm not a Marxist, although I've certainly been influenced by him. I've certainly learned a lot from him. I hear a lot of people on the right talk about how Marx is an idiot and has nothing to say and you should avoid him. That's Philistinism, and it's total bullshit, and you should totally ignore it. Marx was a genius, and he said a lot that we should pay attention to, a lot to learn from. I just ultimately happen to think that the practical political application of his thought is abortive. So a little bit of background as far as the concepts and some of the history that is important to understand when evaluating what Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri are saying in Empire. So if you go back to Hobbes' Leviathan, for example, sovereignty is understood as a transcendent organizing power that represents and forms the coherent whole of a people out of a mere multiplicity of singular individuals that he calls a multitude. Hobbes distinguishes people in multitude. So do these guys, and they like multitude better. Hobbes doesn't. So what that means is that in Hobbes' terminology, there's a war of all against all. There's this infinite multiplicity of isolated individuals waging war against one another in the chaos of the state of nature, in which life is nasty, brutish, and short. And as a result of how terrible this is, in Hobbes' conceptualization of the state of nature, eventually a social contract is struck, and the power of the multitude, the creative potential of the multitude, gets siphoned out, right? And it gets transferred onto the figure of the sovereign, the absolute, the monarch, whatever you want to say. And he represents the people. The multitude are formed into a people through the function of the social contract, through being represented by the sovereign. There's this kind of transfer of power. So I subscribe basically to Schmitt's idea of sovereignty, and I think Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri do as well, which is that the sovereign decides on the state of the exception. He decides. He decides the purpose and the direction of action. And I think here of action in terms of like an art being related to natality, bringing something new into the world, participating in our collective destiny in the wheels of history. So Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri see the whole history of modernity as a means of dealing with the problem posed by the power of the creative potential of the multitude. In the various attempts to manage or preserve the transcendent function, restrain the desire, restrain the potency of the multitude. So modernity is a kind of dialectic of immanent and transcendent forms of sovereignty. You can roughly think about this in terms of the immanent field of action is like the social field, organic, spontaneous, bottom-up. The transcendent is more top-down. So, for example, in a monarchy, which is one solution to this problem they see as the problem of modernity, the monarch is a transcendent sovereign because he makes the decisions at the top and imposes them on the people. In an aristocracy, the elites at the top, they make the decisions, they impose them on the rest of the people. In democracy, it's a more complicated and I would say confused concept than these others, but you can maybe say that it refers to the immanent form of sovereignty, basically a kind of spontaneous production of order that arises out of the interactions of people with one another in the immanent field. They also understand, as many people do, that the development of the nation state has traditionally been associated with capitalism. That the life of the nation state and the life of capitalism are connected, at least in the beginning, because the nation state is necessary for the protection and preservation of property, of establishing the kinds of boundaries that make something like primitive accumulation possible in the first place. But they understand that since this moment in which the nation state and capitalism require each other, there has been a progressive movement in the direction of transitioning the sovereign function from the transcendent field, from the monarch, from the parliament, from Congress, whatever, to the immanent sovereignty of capital. And this process we can associate with globalization. Okay, so what's empire? The name of the book. The global form of sovereignty in the new era of completed globalization we're entering. That's what empire is. He says that empire is the political subject that effectively regulates these global exchanges. It's the sovereign power that governs the world. So while we witness a decline in the sovereignty of nation states, it gets replaced by transnational forms of governance. We're talking about global financial institutions, international bodies, treaties, things like the EU, the UN, NGOs, for example. So sovereignty doesn't disappear, it gets dislocated. He says that empire establishes no territorial center of power and doesn't rely on fixed boundaries or barriers. It is decentered and deterritorializing apparatus of rule that progressively incorporates the entire global realm within its open, expanding frontiers, managing hybrid identities, flexible hierarchies, and plural exchanges through modulating networks of command. Okay, importantly to me also, and I think he gets this part right, he clearly recognizes that globalization is part of the logic of capital. They're totally connected, and this is why the left, that we remember, was anti-globalization. In the name of preserving cultural differences, of preventing the world from all coming under the sway of the market and the universalization of consumer culture, of the total Americanization of everyone everywhere. And he also, in my view, correctly apprehends the relationship between the postmodern politics of recognition and neoliberalism. A logic that is associated, the postmodern politics of recognition, that is, although it maybe positions itself as being against neoliberalism, he understands that they're necessarily connected, because it's a logic that's associated with being against binarisms, wanting to destroy boundaries, hybridize and fluid identities. It's anti-essentialist. We still see this sort of logic all the time, but with different things, like gender, for example. So this, we could call it a differentialist or a deconstructive logic, and he thinks that it's appropriate when we're talking about the modern era. and the era of the nation state, of the sovereignty of the nation state, because this is about policing the boundary between inside, outside, all that kind of stuff. It is concerned with establishing and maintaining binaries. But empire and the form of sovereignty characteristic of empire is not. So he mentions Arif Derlich and Anthony Appiah, for example, who have called the postmodern left now, who still engage in these kinds of arguments, who use this kind of logic that no longer functions. These guys call this intellectual left, the intellectual postmodern left, the comprador intelligentsia of global capitalism. And he says that post-colonialist, postmodern strategies, far from being emancipatory anymore, reinforce the new strategies of rule. The problem for these postmodern thinkers is that they're basically still talking about solutions to problems associated with the nation state and associated with disciplinary society. We've moved into the society of control. Disciplinary society wants to rigidly define and defend boundaries, despite the fact that power is now operative within the framework of empire, so this no longer works. He goes so far as to write that many of the concepts near and dear to postmodernists and postcolonialists, we might also add intersectional third-wave feminists, finds a perfect correspondence in the current ideology of corporate capital in the world market. It's anti-foundational and anti-essentialist discourse par excellence, which is totally bound up with the logic of capital, where differences seem to multiply infinitely in the world market, which attacks nothing more violently than fixed boundaries, which attacks nothing more violently than it overwhelms any binary divisions with its infinite multiplicities. Capital operates, similarly, by increasing differences and stratifying target populations, creating an ever-increasing supply of new subject demographics for marketing and consumption. So this is roughly the alliance, this form of discourse and the logic of the market. This is roughly the alliance that I mentioned in my video about fake news that Nancy Fraser calls progressive neoliberalism. These left-wing, ostensibly anti-authoritarian strategies are, he says, hopelessly rooted in the 19th and 20th century problematics, and they're just no longer relevant. Worse, they've become in the service of capital. They've been outflanked and appropriated by the logic of capital, he says. Despite this, he thinks the passage to empire and globalization isn't necessarily all bad, but gives us new opportunities for liberation, and so he thinks we shouldn't simply resist them. So this is where he makes his move to defend or support globalization too. This is because he believes that the multitude is capable of autonomously constructing a counter-empire, inventing new democratic forms. He wants to oppose empire and globalization, but not with anti-globalization and not with anti-empire. He wants to do so with counter-globalization and counter-empire. He seems to think that these anti-movements are either doomed to failure, with the total victory of the immanent sovereignty of capital over that of the nation-state being a fait accompli, or that any attempt to shore up the nation-state is preservative of a transcendent sovereignty that is inherently oppressive because it forms the multitude into that collective whole. Or both. You might think both of these things. He hopes that in a true world interior of global capital, all these various identity groups, people of different nationalities, different minority groups, will form into a kind of global proletariat that will be truly revolutionary. And that apparently this will lead to truly democratic forms of local autonomous community self-management and decision-making. Part of the reason for this possibility is that the nature of labor, he says, has become increasingly immaterial, with work being roughly divided between affective labor on the one hand and symbol manipulation on the other. So whereas, say, Marx is in the 19th century talking about factory industrial production as the primary form of labor in capitalism, now production is basically biopolitical. And this means a kind of coincidence of what Marx calls the base and the superstructure, a mode of production and the culture that it determines. And and along with this, bosses and management have become increasingly irrelevant in the period of informatization of the labor market. So, I think that basically this view about empire and globalization, where he ultimately comes to be in defense of it because he thinks that it provides new possibilities for the formation of a kind of global proletariat that can take advantage of sovereignty being located in the immanent field and produce, democratic forms of self-management and stuff like that. This idea, I think, has come to animate a lot of left-wing political discourse, and whether explicitly or not, I think it has a lot to do with why the left is now essentially pro-globalization. In a sense, and that's not true of everybody. Angela Nagel, for example, who is another left-wing thinker that I really like, she's anti-globalization still, I think, pretty conclusively. She's for borders. In a sense, Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri, and again, maybe not really consciously, but the left in general, seems to be sort of siding with capital against modernity and the nation state as the political form of sovereignty par excellence in modernity. I think it wouldn't be fair to call him a progressive neoliberal, though. He opposes the differentialist logic of postmodern critique that I would associate with a kind of progressive discourse, and maybe the politics of recognition in general. His thinking here, if I understand correctly, is just sort of, if we are to pave the way for the global multitude, the global poor, sort of consolidating in some revolutionary movement, some revolutionary moment, then it needs to not be broken up into all of these various sub-interest groups and identity groups, and it needs to instead be stressed that they're all alike and they're belonging to what he calls the universal historical subject, which is the poor. In a way, he even seems to me to be almost an accelerationist, actually. But in any case, this is what I think accounts for the pro-globalization left in general. My position, if something about it needs to be said here as well, is that the separation of the sovereign function and the political register is the principal crisis of our time. The swallowing up of power by capital, the immanentization of the sovereign function, and the essential depoliticization of the nation state. To me, this is a great catastrophe. I don't see anything but the most disastrous, oppressive form of the society of control, which there'll be later videos about, being the consequence of this process. I don't see any other alternative. I have a great aversion to the idea, additionally, of a totally homogenized world, of a globally integrated, the global village, and the idea that this means the elimination of all forms of diversity. That's what I worry about. He actually addresses this fear and refers it to the fact, he says, that the logic of the market is differentiating. This is true, and aims to produce differences, produce new demographics, like we said before. It wants to dissolve boundaries, and it multiplies infinitely differences to produce diversity, to produce new demographics that it can target with new marketing strategies, etc. So he says, instead of eliminating or assimilating differences, diversity, it instead produces them. But to me, this response is really insufficient, because it seems to me that the kinds of differences which are produced by capital are the most trivial, banal, superficial kinds of differences imaginable. You get different colors of hair and stuff. I don't know. It's these aren't the differences that I feel like are in need of preserving. I'd also refer him to the paradox of choice. Expanding available choices, differences on demand for consumption, provokes greater anxiety and suffering, not less. So I think his analysis is great, except for the extent to which it's perverted by his progressive aims in general, and these I associate with progressive aims. The fact is that tradition, authority, constraints on choice, boundaries, hierarchies, etc., they do not constitute so many barriers to the exercise of freedom, but are in fact the very conditions for the possibility of freedom. I'll address this more in depth in future videos, but for now, I hope I've gone some way to tackle the question of why the left and globalization have come to be intertwined. This was another episode of Think Culture. I'm John. Please like, comment, subscribe. I'm not the end all be all of interpretation here, guys. So if you want to participate, go ahead. I would like to learn. But anyways, see you next time.